told myself that I will introduce myself and mention the fact that, of course, I did a military service in Israel. I was part of the Israeli intelligence. Of course, I can't say anything more than that because it's part of the intelligence. We're not supposed to talk about it. And more than that, being 50 years old, I already have a son who's 25, and he was a combat officer in the Israeli army, and a daughter who also just finished her military service. She was an instructor of, how are you saying, somebody help me?
Endangered youth.
Endangered youth that the Israeli army is trying to recruit and is trying to help to go through a military service that is considered in Israel actually the door to a better life. And I will explain later why I say that. And the fact that I'm mentioning that is that I heard last week, trying to tell you something about what it means to be an Israeli or to be an Israeli woman. I heard a very interesting lecture last week by a professor who is a specialist on predicting the future or trying to analyze the future and draw conclusions that will help us to decide how to live the present. And he mentioned the fact that there is some kind of an estimation that 20 years, 30 years, people's life are going to be much longer, and we should think about how it would be when people will live 200 years. And I said spontaneously that I wouldn't like to live for 200 years. And there was an argument in the room why. And I wasn't able to really explain that in the first moment. But what I found in myself, and I love my life, I have an interesting life, I have a very fulfilling job, I have a lovely family. And then I said to myself that the fact that I would not like to live 200 years is because I went through one war with my son. My son was, as I said, a combat officer in Protective Edge. And this experience made me understand, it was my first time as a mother. I was already the Director General of Ministry, and it was quite complicated to try to continue taking care of my obligations as the Director General in the Israeli government, having 4,600 employees, some of them recruited to the army, others family members of people who are recruited. But personally, I had a son, and I couldn't sleep for 70 days until he came back home. I literally couldn't sleep. It's not a way of trying to explain that. It was a very difficult experience for me, and I said to myself, I guess that this is a spontaneous feeling that is typical to a mother who lives here in Israel and has to accept the fact that this is part of our life. So this was just an opening remark about myself. Okay, so in 2006, an Israeli soldier near the border of Gaza and caught by the Hamas, the terror organization that is ruling Gaza. And as opposed to all, we have many lawyers in the room, all the international laws about prisoners of war, he was kept without giving us and his family any kind of sign that he is alive or any opportunity to get in touch with him, with no possibility of knowing what is happening with him, whether he is healthy or not, whether he is alive or not. And many efforts were put in bringing him back. Society was very used to terror attacks. It's something that happens in Israel quite often, and it's part of our everyday life. I'm saying that not in order to impress you that we're such a cool society and we are used to that, but to say that this is part of our reality. There are times where it is more often, times that it is less often, but the head of the team that was put in order to try and bring him back had a very interesting observation, and he said that this event of holding a prisoner of war for 5 years with no knowledge is like a continuous terror attack on the Israeli society. A sacred thing, I think, in the Israeli army is the fact that you do not abandon a soldier, a fighter behind you. It's it's something which is very, when I say that, I think that it's supposed to be a rule in every army of the world, and in the Israeli army, and especially because of the size of the Israeli society. We are a small society, we know each other. I don't know how to explain that to people come from such a great nation as the United States, but in Israel there are 8 million people. When we are in war, and this is what I experienced, for example, when we were doing Protective Edge, it wasn't only my son, it was my nephews, it was best friends of my children, it was a whole generation that I'm acquainted with their parents, so the fear of something happening is something that we share in a very, very personal way, and the fact that there is a prisoner of war is something which is the Israeli society cannot be indifferent to. And therefore, a lot of efforts were put in order to try and bring him back, with the usual dilemma of what would be the price of bringing him back. The Israeli society had a very painful experience in that issue. Aircraft fell in Lebanon, and he was caught there also by a terrorist group, and he never came back. And he never came back also due to the fact that the Israeli government refused for many years to negotiate on bringing him back. It was one of the principles that they were trying to put in order to show that it's not worthy to kidnap our soldiers. But then again, when Gilad Shalit was caught, the Israeli public felt that we cannot afford another soldier who will be left behind, and it became something that, demonstrations, I don't even know how to try and explain to you the level of involvement of every Israeli citizen in that story, but a lot of pressure on the government in order to do everything possible in bringing him back. The military possibilities were not good, so what the Israeli commando knew how to do before in other situations of trying to get into Gaza and bring him back was not a possibility. And eventually we had to release 1,100 terrorists held in Israeli prisons, some of them involved in the worst terrorist attacks in Israel. Terrorist attacks were citizens, children, women were murdered in the center of towns, in coffee shops, in restaurants. It was a moment where the Israeli public saw only one thing: the need to bring back that soldier, the need to enable our children to serve in the army, knowing that the Israeli society will do everything in order to bring them back. I remember myself, by the way, because my son was recruited just a few months before he came back. And I remember, actually, I don't like that memory. He came back for the first time from after being recruited, and when he entered the house, he put on the table his, I want to say Pinkas Shevi. It's like it's something that, according to the Geneva Convention, every soldier has a rules of captivity. Yeah, rules of captivity. And I remember that I picked it up and I looked at it, and I said to myself, "Oh, really? The Geneva Convention? It doesn't rule really in the Middle East. I mean, it's only on our side. It's not on the other side." And I said to myself, now it's my son. It's not only Gilad Shalit, but it's also my son who's in danger, and I'm committed to that. But after he was released, and everybody was happy, and Prime Minister welcomed him in person, a great debate started in the Israeli society again, whether it was worth the price, because soon enough, the prisoners who were released, the terrorists who were released, some of them were released back in the territories of Judea and Samaria and started to be involved in terrorist attacks again. 3 boys of 16 were kidnapped, and again there was the army tried to find them around the Judea and Samaria areas, and my son at the time was a combat officer, and during that, prisoners who were released during the Gilad Shalit release were arrested, and he arrested part of the terrorists that I was in charge of helping to release in order to get our soldier back. So this is just a small story in order to explain that in Israel, everything is connected to everything, and when you try to think what would be the right policy in one hand, you have to deal with the complex interests of that policy on another hand, because once he was released, families of terror victims started debating more strongly in the Israeli society that we should grow up as a society and be able to accept the fact that maybe a soldier will be left back and that we cannot pay the price of releasing hundreds of terrorists in order to bring him back. But this is still a very strong debate. I know that the US had soldiers who were kidnapped, soldiers who were captive for many years. And I know that the attitude in the US towards this issue is very different from the Israeli attitude. And many times in Israel, we point at the American policy on these issues and we say we should be like America, we should be very strong and not give up. But it's part of our strength, not only to be able to have a strong army, but to have this solidarity within us that makes us make those decisions and be so much focused on those issues. Now let's go back to the Ministry of Justice. The Ministry of Justice in Israel is in charge of every legal aspect of the government and the legal services that we give. As I said, I have 4,600 employees all over the country. We give services, and of course there is the prosecution, the Attorney General, land registry, legal aid, legal defender. There is a public defender in Israel for every person who is indicted and accused, almost every person. And the question whether there is trust to our services is a big question now in the Israeli society. I think that, of course, we're not supposed to talk about politics, and I won't talk about politics, but if we look at what is happening all over the world, inclusive the US and Israel, we see that people are more and more suspicious towards governments. If we would say that 20 years ago, living in a democracy was something that made you feel that you can trust the people you vote for, you can trust the way the government is acting. In Israel, as it is in many other places, the resentment of the power that the government has is becoming more and more something that is debated, and we have to ask ourselves as the legal authority what we should do in order to gain that trust again, because as the legal authority, maybe you do not trust the health services. I'm not saying that it's not important, but maybe you can buy yourself private health services. Maybe you don't trust other things that the government do, but if you don't trust the legal system in your country, it's a big problem. And part of this problem in Israel is also because we are a multicultural country. We think as the US is the place where everybody immigrated to, and this is how we look at you from the outside, but Israel is also an immigrant society on one hand, and a society where 20% of the society is the Arab population. It's a state that calls itself Jewish and democratic, which means that it is the Jewish state, and even amongst the Jews, there are several groups who are very much opposed to each other, more religious groups, less religious groups, and secular groups. And part of what the ministry is trying to do in order to gain the trust of all those groups is to talk and try to imply diversity. Diversity in the US is something which is very common, it's very implemented in many aspects of life. In Israel, it's not as known or as discussed as it is in the US. And one of my major projects in the ministry is to try to make it more diverse. If I will have more Arab judges, I will have more Arab attorneys. If, for example, I'm giving legal aid to someone from the ultra-Orthodox population, someone from the Arab population, they will always be suspicious. How come they are being represented for free? I mean, this is probably something that the government wants to do in order to make indictments easier or in order to serve the interests of the government. Once I have an Arab attorney who represents an Arab citizen who has some kind of problem with the authorities, obviously there will be more trust of services that the government is giving. And the same is with every group that we're dealing with. Just a year ago, I was heading a committee who was in charge of dealing with the eradication of racism against Ethiopian Jews. We have a group of Jews, it's already a group of 200,000 people in Israel, it's more or less 2% of the Israeli population, who is the only black population in Israel. And they have immigrated to Israel about 30 years ago. And for 30 years, although the government has done many efforts to integrate them completely in the Israeli society, there have been complaints, protests, and all kinds of events that raised a question of whether there is racism which is pointed toward that group. It was a very sensitive issue, and there was a large civilian protest 2 or 3 years ago that started a whole range of things that the government decided to do in order to try and to improve the integration of the Ethiopian Jews in Israel. And as much as the government was making all those efforts, the Prime Minister, in a very brave decision, I think, said, without dealing straightforward with the question whether some of the problems are because of racism, because we look differently at that group of people, we will not be able to make a change. And I got that to my responsibility. We did a very thorough process together with representatives from NGOs and activists from the Ethiopian community in Israel. Unfortunately, we had to admit that indeed in certain authorities, some of the decisions towards the Ethiopian community were based on racism, and that we should take action in order to change that. And I'm giving you that example not because I'm proud of the reasons that brought us to have that committee, but I am proud of the fact that the Israeli society is not afraid of looking at itself and trying to take actions in order to make that change. So if, thanks to that committee, we realized, for example, that there wasn't a single judge in Israel. In Israel, there are 755 judges, and until last year, there wasn't a single judge who came from the Ethiopian community. The Minister of Justice, Ayelet Shaked, a few months after my committee gave its conclusions, nominated for the first time 2 women from the Ethiopian community, who of course were, first of all, excellent lawyers and willing and wanting to be judges. And this is part of understanding that we can talk about justice and we can try to convince that we are acting in the most equal way towards all our citizens. But if you are not represented in all the important places of the government, you will never feel that this government is yours.